Through Birmingham, then, I can't remember. It's like the museum.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is David Gonerman, and I'm on the staff here at the Levitt JCC. Welcome to our latest episode of Southern Jewish Voices, a program currently in its fourth season that strives to record at least a fraction of the many and varied stories of Jewish life in the South and beyond. So you can find all of our episodes from all of our seasons on our YouTube channel. So take a look, there's a lot of stuff there. Special thanks to the Birmingham Jewish Federation and Foundation for partially funding this program. And now I would like to introduce our longtime interviewer, Margaret Norman, and she will in turn introduce her guest, an esteemed member of the history faculty from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. But first, a quick personal note. So Jonathan, Kasha, and I moved here to Birmingham 6 years ago this month. And despite the pandemic, you and Natasha managed to be our first friends here in Birmingham. So thanks for that.
That's awesome. Such a great personal touch, and excited to have Jonathan here with us today. Jonathan's had a fascinating career. We're going to talk about that, as well as, of course, as we do in all our interviews, his life growing up, his Jewish context. And we're going to start where we always do. And so one thing you'll see in this interview is that Jonathan and I also have a few things in common, including that we've lived in a lot of the same places, Birmingham, Berlin, and Hamilton, New York, which is the town where I mostly grew up. So we're going to get to some of those, but I'll start by just saying, you were born in Cambridge and lived mostly in Lexington, Massachusetts until you were 7. I started naming places, and there are others you've spent in your life. We'll get to them all.
Many places, yeah.
Many places. But one thing that you and I share in common that we had fun talking about was that you had an academic childhood. Your mom was a social worker. Your dad was a classics professor at Brandeis. And so I'd actually love to start with a little bit of grounding in that. What are some of the markings of an academic childhood? What made that type of upbringing unique for you?
First of all, thank you so much for that introduction. And yes, I love the Gonermans. And thank you, Margaret. This is great to be a Southern Jewish voice. So this is wonderful. Yes, oh my gosh, we share that. And I'd love to even sound it out more with you at another time. But the academic childhood is it's unique, it's interesting. I didn't really realize it at the time, but you sort of take things for granted, whether it be books everywhere or these mostly nice, often strange people called academics who would come into your house. But it was different. I mean, people were constantly talking about ideas and current events, and I remember Nixon was on everyone's mind and this terrible thing he had done. And it was really striking to me looking back how much just ideas drove every conversation, and a lot of catastrophizing and nerves too, these overthinkers who tended to talk a lot about what's happening to America now that the Watergate Hotel has been broken into. Is this the beginning of the end? And, and ultimately also just the kind of bemoaning the lack of attention to the humanities or to history or to philosophy, all those sort of areas that we tend to still complain about that aren't getting enough attention. But it was a very vibrant, fascinating life that I clearly, in some way, came to emulate.
Yeah, and we'll get a little bit more into some of the ways that shaped the rest of your career. But I think knowing that you started in that environment is important. And the other thing that I think is important to know is that you were in Massachusetts for this early period. When you were a little bit older, your family relocated to the West Coast, to LA, where your dad was teaching at USC. And one thing I'm actually forgetting that I'm hoping you can remind me of is your extended family was sort of centered on the East Coast, right?
Yes. We moved to USC when I was 7 to Los Angeles, which was a big drama in and of itself because everybody was New Yorkers or Hartford, Connecticut, really just New York, New Jersey, and Hartford. And so this was already considered a really huge deal that, they're going west, they're leaving. California is going to be a wasteland. And so, I came to like it, but it was very different. I mean, when I was 7, I just was struck. The first thing I was struck by was the sun, just how different it was. And I mean, I think you're going to ask me possibly about Jewish life there, but it was a striking event because my father was concerned about some issues at Brandeis, this wonderful Jewish university founded in the 60s, of course, which And so he had an opportunity to go west, and we relocated, and it was hard for my mother because she had all her friends there and had a career there too, but we made it work in sunny Southern Cal.
And remind me too, do you have siblings?
I have a brother who's a year older, who I only realized when I was 20 is that for my mom to have waited 2 months to have another child before getting pregnant again was not necessarily planned. It struck me. So I said, Mom, was I an accident? No, you were a lovely accident, whatever the case may be. A sister, 3 years older, and yeah, so 2 siblings and lots of pets that have come and gone.
So the whole family moves to LA, and you're first struck by the sun, which makes total sense. But tell us too a little bit about, Jewish life in LA. We actually haven't had that many folks on this program who have spent time in sort of West Coast Jewish communities. What are some distinctions?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of are, generally speaking, my Jewish upbringing was maybe familiar to many people here. I grew up in a conservative synagogue, both in Massachusetts and then LA. So, and we were very culturally Jewish. Everything seemed to be Jewish in tone and inflected whatever we would talk about. I'll get to the weirdness of LA maybe, but just broadly, if I could tell you about so yeah, we would go to high holidays. We would have Hebrew school, but more interestingly for me, I was struck, especially having learned German as an older person, looking back how many words just in the everyday language were in Yiddish. I mean, remarkable, not just for body parts, your tuchis or your punim or your...
Very important words.
But, even like, clean your room, pick up your gatkes, everything. Not even the fun words that we tend to mimic, but just so much of Yiddish was, and it also was very much just a culturally kind of familiar situation that reminds me so much of the Hanukkah song by Adam Sandler, when everything is sort of understood through, he's Jewish, she's half Jewish, or if Jewish person does something bad, you say that's a shanda for the goyim, may that never happen, why do they have to be Jewish? Everything is sort of seen through that lens, very culturally Jewish. In LA, it was weird though, because I just saw people, I was young, but I saw sort of figures that I would not have seen in Massachusetts, like Jews who surfed or something, which just happens. I know it's weird. But one of my friends named Alan Gelb, I just didn't think of an Alan Gelb as a surfer. But there were people in the sun, sort of sun-bleached Jewish people outdoor. When we built the sukkah, we didn't worry about what the weather was going to be. It was really kind of amazing to see this distinction between kind of the bookish, indoorsy Jews of my family and these outdoorsy Jews. But it was a wonderful thing. You just had constant Jewish life just became outdoors. So much for the old image of, a Jew reading the Talmud and staying indoors and learning. It's just everything moved outside.
That is really interesting. I actually don't feel like you shared it in quite that way in our pre-interview, so I have a few follow-up questions because it's sort of fascinating. One is that, with the amount of Yiddish in your home, where was that coming from? Were your grandparents, give me a little bit more about origin?
Yeah, so origins. We were part of the wave of so many people, probably a lot of people in this room, just about every other Jewish person, if not more, who came fleeing pogroms in the Russian Empire. So my family came in 1880s and 1890s from Ukraine, the Pale of Settlement where Jews were allowed to live within the Russian Empire. They were all Eastern European Jews. Yiddish was the lingua franca, so to speak. And yeah, it just passed through. My grandma would speak Yiddish to my mom, even though she was born here, which is really interesting to me because I think of that as something just people who came over in the 1910s or 1920s maybe. But this was a case of just kind of cultural and linguistic memory. So it's just remarkable, even now if I hear Yiddish, obviously learning German has helped, but I'm just struck by how much it sounds like my grandmother, and less on my dad's side, but my mother's side. My father's side, they came from Austro-Hungarian Empire, and was a little more assimilated, kind of Austrian / Eastern European Jews mixed together.
Yeah, and then it was so interesting to hear you talk about the way that your family was sort of seeing the world through a Jewish lens, the Adam Sandler song. It makes me sort of curious, was your family's social life very Jewish in maybe
Yes.
both locations. Like, tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in Lexington, Mass, which I have very relatively few memories of, a few things, but yeah, that was very Jewish. There was such a large Jewish community, not just from Brandeis, where my dad taught, which was such a Jewish institution. No longer the most Jewish college, though Tulane is number one now.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, in terms of Jewish student body. But my father, we had a lot of Jewish friends, just almost incidentally, like every other neighbor seemed to just be Jewish anyway. In LA, my parents built their social life around the synagogue and academia. Again, though, if you were to bring people from the college, the university to your home, half of them might be Jewish anyway. So it was a really Jewish kind of upbringing. For me, less so. I was just thrown into the public schools, and some of my friends happened to be Jewish, some were. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And then obviously it was fascinating to hear about the sort of the sunny outdoor Judaism. So I do feel like I have to ask, did you learn to surf?
I did not learn to surf. I body surfed, and I got a boogie board. Does anyone remember the boogie boards? Yeah, did they still? And that was pretty fun. But I felt completely inadequate up to the task. Because Alan Gelb, and remarkably a guy, again, these are wonderful names, but a guy with the last name Himmelfarb was a surfer. I just don't know if Hawaii, Himmelfarb, the surfer. But he's this wonderful, these were buff, tough Jews.
So you never
and I wasn't one of them.
fully assimilated into LA life. Well, one thing I want to kind of move us towards, now that we've had a little bit of grounding here is, we talked a lot in our previous conversation about your sort of push-pull with Judaism, especially as you got older and, unfortunately with your father's passing when you were a teenager. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about that as a formative event and how that sort of ties into your Jewish journey.
Yeah, it was interesting. So I was part of a generation and, very similar to maybe some of you, more secular, less secular, what have you, religiously. But, I went to a Hebrew school. The bar mitzvah prep was 4 years, so you go twice a week, Sunday, and then once or even twice during the week after school. So all of that was my upbringing, including, making fun of the Hebrew school teacher and torturing them the way you might have done it in Eastern Europe too, the whole continuity. But I had my bar mitzvah, and then just less than a year after my bar mitzvah, my dad died very suddenly when I was 14. So he kind of dropped dead of a not heart attack, what do you call it? Aneurysm. And that was really hard for me because I was very close to him. It would really, really sort of resonates in ways that I still think through. But he died suddenly, and I was telling Margaret this at a different time. My mom was always trying to get me to the synagogue, obviously for yard site, for other events. And I was already sort of post bar mitzvah, one of those people who might not have gone to the synagogue as much as the rest of my teenagehood. But I did go to one Saturday morning service, and there was a prayer that talked about how the good will be given sort of old age, and there'll be like a tree, plant a cedar in Lebanon or something like that. I think it was actually, I looked it up after, and it was Psalm 92. Not that anyone would know that offhand per se, but it was a really kind of celebrating life is given to the good. And I didn't tell you this, but I actually stormed out. I actually left the synagogue when I heard that, and I never went back for a few years. So I was so angry at that particular prayer. Now, interestingly, I'm sure the Rabbi Henkin or Rabbi Wright could tell me different readings of it, but I never went to the great rabbis to say, what am I getting wrong? I just was really upset by it. And I thought that in that regard, religion was not very helpful in terms of coming to terms with that loss.
And so you kind of take a break from it in some ways.
I took a break. I took a break from religion. I didn't run to other religions, but I took a break from Judaism, feeling actually very mixed about it. Because anyway, as a teenager, I tended to want to assimilate, and I didn't want to sort of be identified by a religion or by a culture. And I was telling you, this is kind of interesting. We can talk about it more, but I actually, for a variety of reasons, one of my grandpas was really into assimilation, and he really would sort of, when I would become grow my hair long or out, and my beard, he would say, "You look too Jewish," which was really striking to me because he meant it like clean up, we assimilate, you look like a rabbi. But I remember thinking too that I wanted to get away as much from his messages as from like the whole organized religion thing. But there's a happy ending because I'm here at Southern.
Yes, spoiler alert, it's going to come back around.
Yeah.
But you can definitely see how in that
Yeah.
moment where you're having this hard moment as a teenager,
Yeah,
and teenagers don't want to be different, how
Yeah,
all
exactly.
those things would feed in. Well, one other thing I wanted to ask you about your father was, in talking about your work, which we're going to get deeper into, you shared with me that he really was the first person to get you interested in learning more about the Holocaust and Nazi Germany. Tell me a little bit about your introduction to those interests.
For one thing, my dad was really unique in his family because everybody had been in business. Like from going back to the minute they got here in Philadelphia to Brooklyn, it was the clothing business, the schmata business, all of that. And my dad's dad had wanted to be a doctor, and his father said, you have to stay in the family business, clothing business. So my dad was the first to break out of that. He really wanted to cultivate in me a respect for learning and whatever you wanted to do. So they were very clear on, you don't have to make a ton of money, history professor. You don't have to do what you want, because he got to. And we just kind of connected. He did this thing when I was a little boy. We'd call it Lincoln and stamps. He would grab his Matthew Brady photographs from the Civil War, these wonderful photographs of Abe Lincoln, of General Grant, all these people. And then he would also grab his old stamp collection, and we would look through it, and he would talk to me about the Civil War and this sectional crisis and slavery. And then we came upon these images of Adolf Hitler, and these just straight up profiles of him right on these stamps from the 30s and 40s. And I was so perplexed and confused. And, I wonder if he weighed how much to say about this, but he probably told me a little more than I should have known about what this guy did to Jews in the world. And that combined, I think I told you this very briefly, and that combined with our annual watching of, Sound of Music, which, so, I remember the Von Trapps, very sort of cultivated story. It's not entirely 100%. They would run away from the Nazis. Yeah. So, I have, as a kind of curious little guy, would ask a lot of questions. And it's interesting now, which I'll talk about, how these two themes of kind of the American South, Civil War, and history in Germany have come together fascinatingly. But yeah, it was always just a little kind of special time with us that would talk about history.
Speaking of academic childhood.
Speaking about, very.
One thing just before I move out of childhood, for the record, I do actually always try to prompt to share names. Would you share your mother and father's name?
Yeah, my mother's Ellen Wiesen, born Cohen, in case you didn't know she was Jewish, if you met her. You don't have any problem with that. David Wiesen, so. Yeah, Wiesen means meadows in German, one of those Jewish last names that the Jews, when they were forced to they had to take on names when they gained citizenship rights. So all of us wonderful last names, Rosenberg, these great, I forgot your name. I know.
My maiden name is Weinberg.
Weinberg, right? Wine Mountain. These great names. Wiesen is one of those great ones that you get to pick off a list in the 19th century. So, yeah.
Well, I'm going to move us a little forward in time. I'm looking here because I've got a quote from you. So you attended Berkeley in the 1980s, and you described that as a wonderful period when everything was alive.
Yes.
And so I would love for you to elaborate on what that means.
Well, Berkeley was great. First of all, it's such a good school, but I didn't worry about that as much, though we had really good professors. Class is a little too big. I always would say to anybody, don't go to a smaller university maybe, but it was exciting. It was right on the bay, of course, the weather, always good. Okay, you can go into San Francisco, but more importantly, they're just the characters in Berkeley. Some of you probably visited or went there even in the 80s. You still have the legacy of the free speech movement from the 60s and the People's Park protests. You called the People's Republic of Berkeley, but it was actually quite mixed politically. Actually, one of my roommates was possibly the most conservative person I've ever met to this day. But what was exciting is just between the sun and the protesting against apartheid and just the cast of characters. Like there was one, all of my friends and I, we used to sit in Sproul Plaza between classes, the main plaza, and just watch these kind of figures. And one of them I remember, I was thinking about this after we spoke, there was a guy who his whole calling, 100%, was to make sure that people, when they prayed to Jesus, if they prayed to Jesus, would not use the word Jesus, but Yeshua, the name in Aramaic or Hebrew that he was called by his family and his followers. And he would stir himself up into a frenzy. He would start screaming Yeshua, saying essentially to anyone who passed, you will not be heard by the Lord if you call him the wrong name. And I'm thinking, like, the Lord probably, if probably knows what you mean well, but when you call him Jesus or whatever the case, as a Jew, I don't do that. But it was just, he would work himself up to a sweat. People would engage with him. It was just these kind of weird and wonderful moments. And of course, I love my classes too.
Yeah, well, that does sound like a really interesting time to be there. And then I think what's interesting after that is you come out of that experience thinking you want to be a lawyer.
Yes.
You ultimately decide that's not for you, I think after taking the LSATs or studying for the LSATs, which I know happens to many people. And you actually spend a year in the catering business
Yes. Yeah.
before going to Brown for graduate school. And so I guess I'm hoping you can connect the dots for us between this experience at Berkeley, deciding afterwards you don't want to go into the legal field. How do you get back to history?
Wow, yeah, it's a good question. I sort of knew deep down that I wanted to do something maybe related to scholarship, but there was a voice of me basically saying, don't do that because you don't want to follow your dad's path. And, those are things that have still haunted me still. You don't want to. I also saw how stressed he was at times about academia and university life. It was wonderful, I think, but I sort of pushed against that, and I thought, I love law, and I took a class at Berkeley on criminal law, but when I took the LSAT and started applying, I couldn't think of why I wanted to be a lawyer. So I did take time off to become a catering secretary, for if anyone knows the East Bay, Claremont Hotel, this fancy white chateau, which was, it's in and of itself an experience. I just have to say how weird it was. I had a really wonderful boss, but his boss was absolutely atrocious. He would fire people all the time, and in the ways that I thought only happened in Hollywood. He would say, like, you're fired, and then people would get their boxes and be escorted. I didn't think it would, I thought firing was like going to HR, we're going to have to release you. No, it was really more than Hollywood. So that didn't help. I didn't think, but I planned bar mitzvahs. I used to dictate the menus into, and people would complain that the medallions of beef were too rare, what have you. But that wasn't for me. I do think I always wanted to go for graduate school. And what happened was I took a class on the Holocaust, actually, from a wonderful professor named Feldman at Berkeley. And I won a prize for a paper I wrote on the idea of evil after the Holocaust. And so my professor, who was lovely, kept saying to me, have you thought about grad school? And there I think I connected the dots. And then I applied while I was working at the hotel. I applied and then got into Brown and a couple other schools and chose Brown.
And I actually think this might be a good moment to kind of pause in the chronology for a minute and just give you a chance to share with our audience, like, your elevator pitch. If you had to describe your work to a group of people who may or may not know, I think they're getting Holocaust, but tell us more.
Some of you know who've done your advanced degrees or PhDs or what have you, how long it takes. In the process of grad school, you pick out this topic that becomes your own. And one of the things that I've been writing about and thinking about and researching about abroad or here for the last 30 years, or I would say three things. First of all, historical memory, how Germans come to terms with the Nazi past. My grandma used to say the Germans haven't done anything to atone. I'm thinking, actually, as we now know more, so that Germans are kind of a model democracy in terms of trying to deal with their own crimes. Mm-hmm. So I wrote a dissertation book on how German companies actually came to terms with their own complicity in crimes. Mm-hmm. Volkswagen, Daimler-Benz, BMW, Krupp. But in that issue of sort of memory, how you remember the past still is something I work with. I think the second issue I have really thought about and written about has to do with personal moral choice in Nazi Germany. How do people make choices under pressure? How much coercion really is there against the general population if you're racially okay? And the third issue that I'm working on now has to do with comparative racism. I've really been interested in how racism in the American South, or broadly in the U.S., compares with race in South Africa and racism and anti-Semitism in Germany. So they're kind of a threefold obsessions.
Yeah, and I have a few more specific questions about
Yeah.
those that I'm going to get to in a little bit. Although I will say one more thing that you just brought up that you and I share again is grandmothers who are a little unsure about why one would choose to go to
Oh, yes.
Germany. So,
Well, she kept saying, my grandma used to say, why don't you study Italian history? Maybe even Florence. Maybe even, she would pick the most beautiful spot and say, why are you going to Germany? Why not? That reminds me too, I went to a synagogue in Bonn, Germany, and this old man asked me services afterwards, what are you doing here and why? And I said, I'm studying modern German history in the 20th century. And he says to me, Mazel tov. Mazel tov. Yeah, Mazel tov. Not very fun, but.
yeah, interesting. And we'll talk a little bit more about living in Germany too. But before I get to Germany, I do want to ask you about, I'm just throwing this one in because it's fun for me.
Yes.
So you actually spent 1 year living in Hamilton, New York, which
Yes.
is the town where I grew up, very rural.
Yes.
Upstate New York. I was 3 years old when he was there, so we did not connect.
I saw this. Were you that little girl?
But tell me a little bit about, this was actually your first academic
Yes.
position after graduate school, and also where you decided you could not live in upstate New York.
Yes, well, I'm so sorry to have to say it to you. You're home. But yes, my first interview when I was still finishing my grad school, my dissertation was actually, it's hard to get a job in history, but I was flown to this weird and exotic place for my first on-campus interview, not just by phone. It was called Auburn. And I loved it, but I didn't get the job. But I did get a 1-year position visiting professorship at Colgate University. And I moved out of Providence, Rhode Island, and moved to Colgate. But I didn't tell you this. I never actually lived in Hamilton because I couldn't find a place to live in Hamilton, which is population 1,900. I lived in Poolville, New York.
Oh,
Do you know Poolville?
yes. Even more
90,
out there.
90 people. The town was so small that the postal code, I had to put Earlville on my address, which didn't help much. So that was about 150 people. So do you know Earlville too?
Yes, I actually
There's
used
an
to go to
opera
camp at the Opera House.
Yes. Oops. Let me put this back on. I think we can do this.
Oh.
Oh, but
Here, let me see if I
Yep.
can.
I loved teaching at Colgate. Wonderful students. My students used to say to me, "Hey, Dr. Wiesen, you're from Westchester County, right?" You mean LA? And they would sort of tag me. Maybe you
There's not that many Jews in Hamilton, New York.
No, they would sort of tag me as not just New York, but Westchester County. Don't ask. It happened more than once.
Oh.
They saw sort of style in me or what have you. A suburban New York, upper middle class. Great students, wonderful life of the mind, but it was not a permanent job. I did have a chance to go back though, and I moved on to Illinois, but it was hard, as I told you. The blizzards, the snowstorms, the lake effect. I remember crashing my car into a guardrail, spinning out, but then you gotta go to your lecture. You don't miss class. So my car is all banged up, I'm banged up, pure adrenaline, I give my lecture. One of my best lectures, pure adrenaline. But I just thought, people would say, just go to LL Bean, get the gear,
When you think about the snow, it was
Yeah.
not for the faint of heart.
And I think there are a lot of upstate New York people in our synagogue, I think. I've met a lot of Rochester folks, and I just can't do it. But maybe I would have. If I had gotten a permanent job there, I would have found my way. I would have gotten the nice gloves and the...
Yeah, and invested. But instead, you go to Southern Illinois, which is a little bit less brutal.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about that. So you actually spent 20 years in Southern Illinois, and also want to add that, someone here, because I know she'll be watching the video at some point, you do meet Natasha, your
Yes.
wife, who's also a historian. So anything
Yes.
you want to share about
Well, I
meeting her?
met
and-
Natasha as a grad student. She teaches U.S. history, and I met her as a grad student in Brown University. And the minute that happens, you say, I found this wonderful person, but she's an academic as well. So you it's always tinged with the reality that the two-body problem, the trailing spouse, whatever you call it, it's hard enough to get one job. But anyway, Natasha and I met in grad school. We instantly hit it off because she was also grew up in a Jewish family, not unlike mine, conservative synagogue, kind of this rare thing because I had not gone out with a lot of Jewish women before, actually. But it felt very natural, and she was just wonderfully humorful and honest and genuine. And so we did face that challenge, and I went to I got my first permanent job at Southern Illinois University in Little Carbondale, Illinois. Some of you might have been there. It's a big connection to Chicago students, so that gives it a little worldly feel. But I taught there for a few years, and then Natasha finished her dissertation, and I had to figure out what to do. And I did end up getting a job in Brooklyn College, but parlaying it. It was they didn't have a job for her in New York, so we parlayed it for a job for her. And we spent 20 years in this really strange cornfieldy town, which was wonderful, gorgeous campus, but middle of nowhere. But Hamilton, your beloved hometown, made Carbondale look like Paris compared to. No.
In case you can't tell, this is not going to be an endorsement of moving to Hamilton.
Well, you can counter it. You can make a pitch.
I'm not going to use our last 20 minutes on that, but if anyone's interested, you can come up to me afterwards, and I can try to sell it to you. I'm not sure I would actually try to sell it to you, but what I do want to ask you about in terms of Illinois is I kind of understand this is where you sort of reconnect with Judaism. Yeah. So if you remember, sort of back away from it a little bit in LA, obviously then you're in Hamilton where we were probably the only other Jews. You come to Illinois and you sort of reconnect. Like, why do you reconnect at that point and how?
First of all, if you're gonna, I even told you when I moved to Hamilton, I was told what courses to teach. And I was told you're teaching Jewish history, which I had never taught. But they took one look at me and they said he's teaching Jewish history. But I learned, that was interesting, but more importantly, I think in a small town like this, you just find your people, so to speak. And there was one synagogue, mostly old people, but some young. And it was interesting. It was a combination of being sort of known as the guy who teaches Holocaust studies, so he can do this, he can do that. We didn't even have a rabbi, so I would volunteer sometimes, / be pushed into it. But it was interesting how it became sort of cozy and familiar. I mean, it was a totally different type of kind of community I'm used to. You know, the sort of small town Jews was just, I didn't think that was even possible. It was almost like an oxymoron. Small town, Southern Illinois Jews. But it was great. It was really, we enjoyed the community, and it became, you know, you become, so to speak, one of those community elders, and it connected me. I sort of really felt good about it with our Passover, community Passovers, our Seders, our other events. It was really nice.
And was becoming a parent part of that too? Because you do have your children during that time.
For sure. And though that's really an interesting part too. I have two boys, one 18 and one 23, and they growing up though were almost entirely with non-Jewish kids. And there were so few Jews even of their age in Illinois, that part of Illinois, that was tricky. So you try to give them a little Jewish life. And that's also the imperative. You feel as a parent like, we should know this stuff. Let's keep things going a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I want to kind of bring us to Birmingham a little bit. So you moved here actually just months before COVID struck. And we can talk a little bit about that also, but I'm curious, like before COVID strikes, first of all, what makes you all interested in moving to Birmingham? Yeah. Although now I'm learning it's a little full circle since you did apply to that job at Auburn.
Yeah.
And what's your initial reception in the Birmingham Jewish community?
Oh, first of all, part of the reason we moved, we've been 20 years at Southern Illinois, and that was a university that was struggling, and it lost 50% of its enrollment, partly because, during the time I was there, partly because they tried to remake the university as a non-party school. And the Belushi brothers went there. So you don't, if it ain't broke, they really worked hard to sort of de-Chicago it, which is pretty kind of tricky. And so it lost its brand. It was a great university. I mean, really wonderful professors, and I loved it. But it was going through crisis talk, constant anxiety. So, everybody was leaving. And they all went south, interestingly. Tons of people look south. I mean, this is when UA was recruiting from Illinois, such that more people in the county where I lived in Illinois were going to University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa, than they were going to universities in Illinois. There was a crisis with the budget. And there was an opening for a department chair at UAB, and I applied, I got an interview, and I had already been chair of my department for a few years the history department at Southern Illinois University. So I came down and I loved it. I had the same reaction that everyone has when I give them the tour. They take me around and you don't know what you're going to expect because I hadn't been here, but you have images of the civil rights struggle in your head and segregation, but you keep seeing things that challenge the views you didn't even know you had, and then you drive up toward Vulcan. And this is a strange thing, but I said it too. People who I drive around say, I didn't know Birmingham had hills, and But did you know that it didn't have hills? But it's remarkable. It was just so beautiful. And just coming here, I immediately, speaking of a home, I kind of gravitated toward Bethel, picked the conservative synagogue, and I met the wine ribs very fast, who were very, very warm and giving. And yeah, it was just very sort of familiar and cozy and very grounding. So I sort of found it just a very familiar and comfortable and manageable Jewish community.
Yeah, well, I'm actually going to use this as a chance to transition to a few more questions about your work, some of which are kind of related to UAB. One is, you shared with me that you teach a lot of undergraduates, and UAB doesn't have a very large Jewish undergraduate population, especially in the humanities. So I guess I'm curious to learn what it's been like to teach, classes of mostly non-Jewish students about the Holocaust and Nazi Germany.
Well, I mean, Zoe can relate to this, I'm sure, but yeah, we have. I dare say, I maybe have had one or two Jewish students in my Holocaust classes or my modern German classes, which is remarkable because, there's a huge, as we know, a substantial Jewish community. But we're dealing with students who are curious about it. They've watched the History Channel, they've watched documentaries, but they've never met a Jewish person, let alone a Jewish professor. And the most interesting thing is not just their openness, which is great, but just their lack of understanding of what Judaism is or what versions of Judaism are. So we actually start with just some basic, frequently asked questions. And it's just remarkable to see, a lot of students don't know that Jesus is not part of our worldview. They thought he was a prophet, like in Islam, not that. They wanted to know a lot about anti-Semitism, very empathetic, coming from different strains of Christianity that are very sympathetic to Jewish life. But it's been very interesting because you're almost teaching about the religion as much as you are about the history of what happened to these people. And I think that's good. I think that should happen in any class.
I was going to say, do you like that? Do you enjoy that role?
I like it. It's a little strange sometimes being in the Bible Belt, just the level of kind of, it's still hard to penetrate some hard, sort of really stubborn views. There is this, occasionally I would get something from a student, they're really sensitive, but they'll still say by the end of the semester, as a forsaken people, Jesus was punishing the Jews for not having converted. I'm like, wait a minute, did you not learn anything? But you can't shake that all, but it's fascinating. I don't react hostilely. I'm very intrigued by it. There may be a certain point when I'm no longer intrigued, but I find...
But for now, you are. Well, one other thing I'll kind of ask you related to students is, we did talk a little bit too about what sort of specific opportunities and challenges you've had after October 7th. And that is sort of like an extra layer on your role as maybe the only Jewish person that some of these students are in contact with.
People have come to my office after October 7th with just questions. It's interesting. There are students who immediately, as part of social media and their own exposure to the horrors of the Middle East conflict, they'll sort of have this weird sense. They have this sense that there are good guys and there are bad guys. And they come to me and they'll say things like, what is Zionism? And is it good? Is it bad? I'll find, though, that students, and there are not that many at UAB compared to other universities that we've followed, but the students who really kind of start with a critical position of Israel, or they start with distress over the images they're seeing, they're just more than anything curious. And this is what I was telling you earlier. I think even the students who take positions very quickly on the good guy and the bad guy, they really, they just want to learn and explore their ideas. They want to be challenged. I find this constantly. They'll say something, they'll say their piece, then you talk. I mean, I have the authority of the being professor, but they listen and they engage. Clearly, I mean, one thing I was going to say, though, about that is that's a lot of it's still informed by a lack of knowledge of history. So I was telling you earlier, regardless of what you think about what's happening in the Middle East, there's very little understanding that Jews originate from this part of the world. And so that already paused, a student of mine thought that in 1947, after the Holocaust, they kind of picked a random place. And I said that this is, to the extent that you care about this, I think it's important to know that the religion was born here. This is every year we say next year in Jerusalem. So it has to mean something in the discussion. And I'm like, I didn't know that Jews were from there. I thought they were from Europe. So these are the sort of things that you encounter, and it's probably not just in a more Christian part of the world here, but I'm sure it's everywhere, where students want to learn, and sometimes that is lost in the loudness of the social media posts after October 7th.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear about sort of all these different roles that you hold within your role in this specific context. And one more question about your work that's moving a little bit away from that question, but I don't want to miss it, is, you did mention that your work to some extent looks at connections between the American South, Nazi Germany, Jim Crow, but you also shared with me in our pre-interview that is a subject that people sort of misunderstand. And so I'm hoping you can share with us like what people get wrong about that and what you think the most important
Yeah,
thing
this is kind of interesting. So I actually showed a screening of a movie called, it's based on the book Cast. No, I can't remember. Isabel Wilkins.
Yeah.
Origin. Anyway, until about 2015, most students would say the Holocaust was something powerfully unique, coming from the traditions of Jew hatred and anti-Semitism throughout the centuries, all correct. But more recently, especially around the publication of Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, there's been a penetrating of ideas into the kind of general understanding that the Nazis got their ideas of Jim Crow, racism from the American South. Now, in my book that I've just finished, I talk about how Nazis sent people to the U.S. South to study race. There was always a conversation between racists around the world and Nazis who were designing anti-Semitic persecution and policies. But I think it comes home the most. I'll just tell you a quick anecdote if we have time. Yeah. My son was part of a wonderful program at the BCRI, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, called the Legacy Program, where he learned to be a docent, gave tours, and he had to do this training. And he came home one day after his Tuesday night class, and he said, "Dad, do you know where the Nazis got their ideas about anti-Semitism?" And I said, "No, where?" But I could predict from the U.S. South. I said, "No, not really." So there's a misunderstanding that almost every one of my students brings now, that the kind of Nazis were looking at Jim Crow racism, which is, of course, horrible, segregation, and then kind of imitated it. And this comes through in now, it's almost now become a sort of commonplace. And I have to remind them that there's thousands of years of discrimination that go into the Holocaust, but that there are interesting interactions. So I think that's a weird turn in the last 10 years. And I think it's a good thing in that students are coming to terms with racism in America and the legacies. But it's interesting now that there's one cause and effect that I really reject.
And why do you think it's important that people understand that correctly?
Well, I think it's... I keep pushing.
Sorry, your mic.
As long as you can hear me. No, it's me. It's the thumb touches right here. How many minutes do we have?
Here, take mine and I'll fix it while you...
This is all being recorded too. Okay. I think it's important because I think that what happens is it reflects a sense among young people, a good sense that, there are many crimes in history, many misdeeds. That's good. But what it does is that in their minds, it starts to diminish the horrors of the Holocaust. They're not consciously doing it, but what they're saying is that if the Holocaust is just imitative and derivative, then there's the true bad guys first, and that's Southern racists, that's, Orville Faubus or all these, Governor Wallace. But I just want them to understand that there is a whole tradition of anti-Semitism that they should look out for still today that's rearing its ugly head. I think I just want to kind of, as a historian, adjust the picture.
Yeah.
Bring it into focus.
No, that makes complete sense, and I think it's a really interesting thing for us all to walk away with. Because we are getting towards the end of our time. I have a few questions that I want to make sure we get to. One that I haven't sort of properly circled back to yet is, you have spent quite a bit of time living in Germany at different points. What is it like to be a Jewish person studying the Holocaust in Germany?
Well, it's interesting and very powerful, actually. I think we talked about this a bit, and I'd be curious, again, you did I had to tell you all my life, but I want to know your time in Berlin. But yeah, I've lived in Cologne and Munich and Berlin, just studying and getting fellowships to do the research. It's been powerful because that's where I do recognize how much work Germans have done to kind of build a democracy based on memory and based on good relations with Jews. Not that there isn't the AFD and the rise of anti-Semitism, it's always been there. I mean, one of the weird things that actually you find sometimes is there's a level of philo-Semitism, love of Jews, that can be really weird too. So there's so much compensation for the crimes of Nazism that you'll find that people almost want to spend more time with you because you're Jewish and you're kind of a native informant. Also, this is a phenomenon that is gets beyond maybe what we're talking about, but certain philo-Semitism relies on same old stereotypes about Jews. Like, you know, I had a German person say to me in all seriousness, I love Jews. They're good with money, but that's good. That's good. Or, you know, the Jews control Hollywood, but I love Hollywood. It kind of,
Hard to know how to react to that one.
I'm like, oh my gosh, where do I start?
Yeah.
But there is a sort of phenomenon in Germany called Betroffenheit, which means just being affected deeply by the past. And you see these remarkable moments when people are trying to do the right thing, you know, having kosher catering when there are no Jews in case a Jewish person comes to an event, or just even I once visited Dachau, their first concentration camp. And back then, and still now, might be safe to hitchhike, and a woman picked me up on the way back to Munich, and she just asked what I was doing there, and I told her my studies, and she started crying. I mean, her father was a perpetrator of some sort. It's just this kind of intensity that, for a while, it's kind of interesting and fun. And after a while, you're thinking, I don't know if I want to keep... But, you know, it's a very powerful and deep thing. In Germany, it's just a great country. It drives me crazy sometimes with some of the rules and regulations. People are in their space. But it's just it's a powerful example of history and democracy working together, and memory.
Yeah, really fascinating. And it kind of leads me a little bit into my next question, because I'm going to lump a few things in here. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit, too, about the work you've done with AHEC to memorialize that history here in Birmingham. Also, you've been working with our Kesher students this past year. And I'll also just throw in that, you know, you were on our team that helped get the marker at Temple Bethel. Like, tell me about how some of your community activities, you know, come from and feed into your work.
Well, that reminds me, when I did look at Birmingham as a potential new home, I was immediately drawn to that civil rights history and the kind of work around it. So I had been reading about the Equal Justice Initiative, and at that time, the BCRI, the Birmingham BHEC, the Birmingham Holocaust Education Center. So these were automatically sort of alluring to me. When I first got here, I worked with the BHEC giving lectures. I eventually joined the board, and Lynn Raviv would say, how about doing that? Or how about doing that? And I would say, okay. But it was really powerful. I think it's great. It's sometimes hard because the Alabama Holocaust Education Center is designed to sort of speak to broad publics and speak to children often, and which is the best thing. That's why I love it and its mission. But sometimes when you hear something there in terms of, you know, how they're pitching, really sophisticated in many ways, but also, I always want to say, like, it's more complicated, but you can't...
That's the historian.
That's the historian. It's complicated is our mantra. But it's a really different, nice to see kind of your work applied, kind of history in action and students move. I also, you know, got to do that marker with you and work and the Temple Bethel civil rights experience, just really bringing my sensitivity to racial injustices and racism to that part of the equation. So it really fed into my own work, which I had actually started the project beforehand, but it was a perfect kind of match for me.
And everybody should go watch Jonathan in the opening film of the civil rights experience.
I look very pious.
Haven't been on the tour, yes.
I have my yarmulke on, and I walk through the synagogue, and
a lot of slow shots of you looking at the synagogue. But two kind of quick closing questions for you. One, I'm curious if there's anything you would add to, you know, we've kind of gone through your Jewish arc. Yeah. Is there anything you would sort of add to bring that full circle?
Well, I mean, it sounds like a cheesy full circle, nice pat ending, but it is really interesting to see how I did have that alienation, but now I do feel really at home. It's almost like a natural fit. You know, I feel like anybody as you get older, you find a little bit more your own voice. And it's just been such a kind of natural home to be amongst Jewish people, and we speak a similar language, similar worries, even if you have like different political positions, there's that same kind of, I think, ethical and spiritual approach to the world and its problems. So it's just all kind of really natural for me. I will say too that it's just nice being in a community. It's manageable. LA was huge Jewish community, very diffuse, and you could go in, you could go out, and that's also true here, but it's just more kind of familiar in terms of manageable. Jewish film festivals or film series, events at JCC or the Federation. All of that is sort of, you can work it into your daily life in ways that are manageable. So that's been really great too.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then my last question for you, very important, is I want to give you a moment just to plug your new book and what it's about and where people can find it so they can read more about all the things we've talked about.
Thank you so much. So I have a book coming out. It's got 2 titles. It's about to go up. It's not going to be ready till the end of the year, unfortunately. It's going to be on Amazon soon to pre-purchase. It's called Modern Germany and the American Color Line, or it's called Birmingham to Berlin, Modern Germany.
But why does it have 2 titles?
Oh, well, one of them is just, we're playing with titles.
Okay,
The last,
so it will be one of those things.
one of those 2. It'll be either Birmingham, Berlin, Modern Germany, and the American Color Line. And basically what it does is it begins in the 19th century, traces the story of how Germans came to visit the U.S. South to study race and racism, race relations, how they brought back some ideas, rejected others. And it then focuses a lot on the Scottsboro event in 1931 when the Scottsboro boys were arrested and framed for falsely accused of trying to rape a woman on a train in Alabama. Germans, more than any other group, really get involved with that, German Jews. So I look at that, and then I kind of end in the Nazi period, raising some of these issues that I raised earlier, but really focusing a lot on a guy named Heinrich Krieger who came to study at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville and then goes back to Germany and works for the Nazi race office and brings some ideas, rejects others, but I kind of look at him as this interesting figure that goes to the U.S. South and back to Germany. So just the sort of story of America and Germany talking about race.
Well, even though it's not out to the end of the year, and we don't know the title yet, we'll try to share it with everybody.
Yes, I will bombard you, I'm sure, Margaret.
And we'll look forward to reading it. And thank you so much,
Thank you,
Jonathan,
Margaret.
for being
It was
here
really great.
today.
Appreciate it. Thanks.